Tonight, I want you to imagine a world where winter was not merely uncomfortable, it was feared. A world where a single season of cold weather could determine whether an entire family survived until spring. There were no heated homes, no electric lights, no weather forecasts, no supermarkets filled with food, only long months of darkness, uncertainty, and relentless cold. Across medieval Europe, millions of ordinary people entered each winter knowing that hunger, illness, and freezing temperatures might soon arrive at their door. For them, survival was never guaranteed. Now imagine yourself standing on the edge of a small village, sometime during the Middle Ages. The harvest has already ended. The fields are empty. The trees stand bare against a pale, gray sky. A cold wind moves quietly across the countryside, not yet dangerous, not yet severe, but strong enough to remind everyone that winter is coming. The villagers know what lies ahead. Every year brings the same challenge. Gather enough firewood, store enough food, protect the animals, repair the roof, seal the walls. Prepare for months that may test every ounce of human endurance. As daylight slowly fades, smoke rises from small cottages scattered across the landscape. Inside those homes, families work by the light of flickering flames. Children help carry bundles of wood. Parents inspect food stores one final time. Everyone understands that once winter fully arrives, opportunities become scarce. Mistakes become costly, and nature offers little mercy. To modern eyes, the first snowfall might appear beautiful, a peaceful blanket of white covering fields and rooftops. But for a medieval family, beauty and danger often arrive together, because beneath that quiet snow waited uncertainty. Would the food last? Would disease appear? Would the livestock survive? Would spring arrive before supplies ran out? No one could know. And so, as the first flakes drifted from the darkening sky, people prepared themselves for another long struggle against the cold. As autumn faded into winter, daily life began to shrink. The world outside grew colder, the days grew shorter, and people spent more and more of their lives inside small wooden cottages that offered only limited protection from the elements. Most peasant homes were simple structures. Many consisted of a single room shared by an entire family. Parents, children, and sometimes even animals occupied the same space throughout the coldest months of the year. To modern eyes, these homes would appear cramped and uncomfortable. Yet for medieval families, they represented safety. The walls were often made from timber, woven branches, mud, and straw. Small gaps allowed cold air to enter. Strong winds found their way through cracks in doors and walls. During particularly cold nights, frost could form on the inside of the building itself. The fireplace served as the center of daily life. Food was cooked there, stories were told there, and most importantly, it provided warmth. But warmth came at a price. Firewood was precious. Every log burned today would not be available tomorrow. Families constantly balanced comfort against survival. Burn too much wood early in the season, and they might face terrible hardship before spring arrived. As darkness fell each evening, families gathered around the fading fire. The outside world disappeared into silence. Beyond the walls stretched frozen fields, leafless forests, and snow-covered roads. Travel became difficult, sometimes impossible. Entire villages could feel isolated from the rest of the world for weeks at a time. This isolation shaped the rhythm of winter life. There were fewer visitors, fewer markets, fewer opportunities to trade goods. People relied heavily on whatever they had managed to store during the harvest season. Barrels of grain, dried beans, root vegetables, salted meat if they were fortunate. Every meal was carefully measured, every resource counted. Breakfast might consist of a simple porridge made from oats or barley. Lunch could be little more than bread and thin broth. Dinner often looked much the same. The goal was not enjoyment. The goal was endurance. Children learned these realities from a very young age. They understood that food could not be wasted, that clothing had to be repaired rather than replaced, that every member of the household had responsibilities. Even small children gathered kindling, carried water, and cared for animals. Winter left little room for idleness. The cold itself was exhausting. Many people spent months feeling perpetually chilled. Their fingers cracked from exposure. Their skin became rough and dry. Simple tasks required greater effort: fetching water from a frozen well, walking through deep snow, carrying wood across icy ground. Everything became more difficult. Yet despite these hardships, winter was not a season entirely without comfort. When storms howled outside and snow covered the countryside, families often spent long evenings together. Stories passed from generation to generation. Legends of kings, saints, heroes, ancient battles, mysterious creatures said to roam forests after dark. For many children, these stories became treasured memories. The firelight flickered across faces, shadows danced on walls, and for a few hours, hunger and cold seemed slightly farther away. In a world without television, radio, or internet, storytelling held enormous power. It entertained, it educated, and perhaps most importantly, it reminded people that they were not facing winter alone. Their parents had endured it. Their grandparents had endured it, and countless generations before them had done the same. Outside, however, winter continued its relentless advance. Snow accumulated on rooftops. Ice formed along rivers and streams. Animals consumed precious stores of fodder, and each passing day brought families one day closer to the most difficult period of the year. Because the greatest challenge of winter was not usually the beginning. It was the middle. The long weeks when supplies started to run low, when the excitement of the first snowfall had disappeared, when spring still felt impossibly far away. Those weeks tested people more than any storm ever could. The cold was no longer an event. It became a constant companion, a silent presence that followed every moment of daily life. And for many medieval families, the true struggle was only just beginning. By the middle of winter, the landscape could become almost unrecognizable. Paths that once connected villages disappeared beneath snow. Fields vanished beneath frozen layers of white. Rivers slowed, and in particularly cold years, some froze entirely. The world seemed quieter, still, as if nature itself had fallen asleep. Yet beneath that silence, life remained a constant struggle. Food was often the greatest concern. A successful harvest in autumn did not guarantee comfort during winter. Stored grain could spoil. Rats could invade food supplies. Unexpected cold might force families to consume more resources than planned. Every household watched its remaining provisions carefully. A barrel that looked full in October could appear alarmingly empty by February. For poorer families, hunger was a familiar companion. Meals became smaller. Broths grew thinner. Bread contained more fillers and less grain. People learned to stretch every ingredient as far as possible. A handful of beans, a few onions, perhaps some dried peas. Nothing could be wasted. During especially harsh winters, people searched for food wherever they could find it. Wild herbs, roots hidden beneath snow, anything that could help sustain life until spring. For livestock, winter was equally dangerous. Cows, sheep, goats, and chickens depended on fodder gathered months earlier. Every animal represented value: milk, eggs, wool, labor. Losing livestock could devastate a family's future. Farmers often worried about their animals as much as themselves. Inside dark barns, animals huddled together for warmth. Their breath formed clouds in the cold air. The sounds of shifting hooves and rustling straw filled the darkness. Families checked on them constantly. A sick animal could mean disaster. A dead one could mean hunger. Winter also brought another enemy: disease. Cold weather alone did not cause illness, but it created conditions where sickness spread more easily. People spent long periods indoors. Rooms were crowded, ventilation was poor, Smoke from fires irritated lungs and eyes. Many medieval people lived with a constant cough throughout the colder months. A simple infection could become serious. What might be a minor illness today could become life-threatening centuries ago. Children were especially vulnerable. The elderly were vulnerable. Anyone weakened by hunger faced even greater danger. When illness entered a household, fear often followed. There were no antibiotics, no hospitals as we know them today, no understanding of bacteria or viruses. People relied on herbal remedies, prayers, and whatever wisdom local healers possessed. Sometimes patients recovered, sometimes they did not. The uncertainty itself was exhausting. Every fever became a source of anxiety. Every cough raised concern. Families watched loved ones carefully, hoping each morning would bring improvement. Yet despite all these difficulties, communities rarely faced winter entirely alone. Neighbors helped neighbors whenever possible. A family with extra firewood might share some with those who had less. A household that managed to preserve more food than expected might quietly assist another that was struggling. These acts of kindness were not uncommon. People understood that survival often depended upon cooperation. The same individuals who needed help one winter might be the ones offering help the next. Shared hardship created powerful bonds. In many villages, people checked on elderly neighbors during severe weather. They helped repair damaged roofs. They carried supplies through deep snow. They offered comfort when illness struck. Not because life was easy, but because everyone understood how fragile life could be. Winter had a way of reminding people that no one survived entirely on their own. And so, while snowstorms raged outside and icy winds swept across empty fields, another force quietly worked within medieval communities. Not wealth, not power, not comfort, but solidarity. The simple understanding that human beings endure difficult seasons best when they endure them together. As the long nights continued, villagers waited patiently for signs of change. A slightly warmer afternoon, a small drip of melting ice, a bird returning earlier than expected. Tiny signals that spring still existed somewhere beyond the frozen horizon. For now, however, winter remained in control. The nights were still long, the food stores were still shrinking, and the hardest weeks of the season had yet to pass. As winter deepened, the darkness itself became one of the greatest challenges of medieval life. In many parts of Europe, daylight seemed to vanish almost as quickly as it arrived. The sun rose late, it set early, and long hours of darkness stretched across the land. Modern cities glow with electric light throughout the night. Medieval villages did not. Once the sun disappeared, darkness settled heavily over homes, roads, forests, and fields. Only candles, oil lamps, and fireplaces pushed back the shadows. For poorer families, even these sources of light had to be used sparingly. Candles required valuable materials. Lamp oil was not always easy to obtain. Every resource mattered. Many households simply accepted the darkness. Daily activities ended earlier. People slept longer. The rhythm of life adjusted itself to the season. Historians believe that sleep itself may have been quite different during the Middle Ages. Many people likely slept in two separate periods: a first sleep shortly after nightfall, then a period of quiet wakefulness, then a second sleep before dawn. During those silent hours between sleeps, people prayed, reflected, tended fires, or simply sat quietly while the rest of the household rested. Outside, the winter night possessed a beauty that few modern people experience. Without electric lights, the stars appeared astonishingly bright. Entire rivers of light stretched across the sky. The Milky Way glowed overhead. On clear nights, the heavens seemed endless, yet beauty often existed alongside fear. The medieval world was filled with uncertainty. Dark forests surrounded many settlements. Travel after sunset was risky. Legends flourished in the darkness. Stories of spirits, wandering souls, strange creatures lurking among the trees. Today, these tales may seem like simple folklore. But in an age without scientific explanations for many natural phenomena, such stories often felt very real. A distant sound in the woods, an unfamiliar shadow, a sudden movement beyond the edge of a fire's glow. The imagination filled countless gaps in understanding. Winter nights gave those imaginations plenty of room to wander. Storms were particularly unsettling. Strong winds rattled roofs and walls. Snow struck windows. Trees groaned beneath the heavy ice. Families gathered close to the fire while nature unleashed its power outside. For children especially, such nights could feel endless. The sounds of the storm transformed familiar homes into places of mystery. Every creak seemed louder. Every shadow appeared larger. And yet, these experiences became woven into the fabric of daily life. People learned to live alongside uncertainty, to accept that some things could not be controlled. The weather would do as it pleased. The seasons would arrive and depart according to their own schedule. Human beings could prepare, they could adapt, but they could never fully command nature. This reality shaped medieval thinking in profound ways. Many people viewed winter not simply as a physical challenge, but as a spiritual one. The season encouraged patience, humility, endurance. It reminded individuals of their dependence upon forces far greater than themselves. Religious faith often became especially important during these months. Churches remained centers of community life. Their stone walls offered shelter from the cold. Their familiar rituals provided comfort. The sound of prayers echoed through candlelit interiors, while snow covered the world outside. For many villagers, faith helped make sense of hardships that otherwise seemed impossible to explain. When crops failed, when disease appeared, when storms destroyed homes, people searched for meaning, and winter provided many opportunities for reflection. Perhaps that is one reason the season has inspired so many stories throughout human history. Winter strips life down to its essentials: warmth, food, shelter, companionship, hope. Things that often go unnoticed during easier times suddenly become precious. As medieval families sat beside their fires and listened to the wind outside, they were reminded of those truths every single day. The darkness might be long, the cold might be relentless, but somewhere beyond the frozen fields and snow-covered forests, spring was waiting. The challenge was surviving long enough to see it, and for some families, the coming weeks would prove to be the most difficult of all. For those who lived through the Middle Ages, winter was more than a season of cold weather. It was a test, a long and unforgiving examination of preparation, patience, and resilience. And nowhere was this more evident than in the final months before spring. By late February, many families found themselves entering what historians sometimes call the hunger gap. The harvest from the previous year felt distant. Food stores had been steadily shrinking for months. What once seemed plentiful now appeared alarmingly scarce. A barrel that had looked reassuringly full in autumn might contain only a thin layer of grain at its bottom. The smoked meats prepared before winter had often been consumed. Dried vegetables were running low. Even the most careful planning could be challenged by an unusually long season. Each meal became a calculation, each portion carefully measured. People learned to live with constant uncertainty. Would supplies last another week, another month? No one knew. The weather held the answer. If spring arrived early, there would be relief. If winter lingered, hardship could quickly intensify. For many medieval families, hunger was not always dramatic. It was gradual, a persistent emptiness, a dull ache that followed people throughout their daily routines. Meals became smaller. Energy became harder to maintain. Tasks that once seemed ordinary required greater effort. The body adapted as best it could. But adaptation had limits. Children often felt these shortages most severely. Growing bodies required nourishment. When food became scarce, the youngest members of society frequently suffered first. Parents made difficult decisions. Many willingly reduced their own portions to provide a little more for their children. Such sacrifices occurred quietly in countless homes across Europe, rarely recorded, rarely remembered, yet repeated generation after generation. Winter revealed extraordinary acts of love hidden within ordinary lives. At the same time, communities searched for signs that the season was finally weakening. People paid close attention to nature, a patch of exposed earth, a stream beginning to flow again, the return of certain birds, the appearance of buds on distant branches. These small details carried enormous emotional weight. They were evidence that winter's grip might finally be loosening. The first hints of change often brought renewed optimism. Yet medieval people knew better than to celebrate too early. Some of the worst storms arrived near the end of winter. Unexpected snowfalls could erase hopes almost overnight. A few warmer days might be followed by weeks of freezing temperatures. Patience remained essential. Nature moved according to its own schedule, not human expectations. During these final weeks, people spent increasing amounts of time preparing for the work ahead. Spring would not simply arrive and solve every problem. Fields would need attention. Tools would require repair. Animals would need care. Seeds would have to be planted. The return of warmer weather meant the beginning of another demanding cycle. Life in the medieval world rarely became easy. The challenges merely changed shape. Yet after months of darkness and cold, even hard work felt welcome. It meant survival. It meant another chance. It meant life continuing forward. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the days began to lengthen. Sunlight lingered a little longer each evening. The angle of the sun changed. Snow retreated from south-facing hillsides. Water dripped from rooftops during warmer afternoons. Sounds returned to the landscape. Birdsong, flowing streams, the distant movement of animals. The countryside slowly awakened. For families who had endured the long winter, these changes felt profound. Every sign of renewal carried meaning. Every indication of spring brought relief. Not excitement in the modern sense. Something deeper, a quiet gratitude, because survival had never been guaranteed. Many people entered winter with uncertainty. Some never emerged from it. Those who did understood the value of simple things. A warm day, fresh water, green shoots pushing through thawing soil, the smell of earth after months of snow. Experiences that modern people often overlook could feel almost miraculous after a harsh medieval winter. Perhaps that is one reason winter occupied such an important place in the medieval imagination. The season reminded people of both their vulnerability and their strength. It demonstrated how fragile life could be, yet it also revealed humanity's remarkable ability to endure. Again and again, year after year, generation after generation, across countless villages, towns, and farms, people faced the same cold winds, the same dark nights, and the same uncertainties. And somehow they continued. Not because life was easy, not because conditions were comfortable, but because human beings possess an extraordinary capacity to adapt, to hope, and to persevere. As the last traces of winter slowly faded from the landscape, medieval families emerged from their homes to begin another year. The fields awaited them, the animals awaited them, the future awaited them, and although new challenges would certainly come, they had already overcome one of nature's greatest tests. They had survived the winter, just as their ancestors had done before them, and just as countless others would do long after they were gone. For a brief moment, beneath the growing warmth of the spring sun, that was enough. Yet winter was not experienced equally by everyone. A poor peasant and a wealthy noble might live within the same kingdom, endure the same snowfall, and witness the same frozen landscape. But their winters could feel like entirely different worlds. For the nobility, winter brought discomfort, but rarely starvation. Castles were cold places by modern standards. Their stone walls absorbed the chill and seemed to hold it for months. Large halls could feel drafty even when multiple fires burned throughout the day. Visitors often remarked on how difficult it was to keep such enormous buildings warm. Yet, nobles possessed advantages that ordinary villagers could only imagine. Their food stores were larger. Their servants performed much of the daily labor. Their wardrobes contained heavier fabrics and expensive furs. While peasants worried about having enough bread to survive until spring, noble households often continued hosting feasts throughout the colder months. The contrast could be striking. In one village, a family might carefully divide a loaf of bread among several children. A few miles away, a lord's table could display roasted meats, imported spices, and barrels of wine. Medieval society was deeply unequal, and winter often revealed those inequalities more clearly than any other season. Yet wealth did not eliminate every danger. Disease ignored social status. Cold weather reached castle walls just as it reached village cottages. A harsh winter could still isolate noble families from the outside world. Roads became difficult to travel. Messengers arrived late. Supplies sometimes failed to reach their destinations. Even kings occasionally found themselves trapped by weather. Throughout history, armies have learned that winter can be a more formidable enemy than any opposing force. Many military campaigns simply stopped when severe weather arrived. Snow and ice transformed roads into obstacles. Horses required enormous amounts of food. Soldiers struggled to remain healthy. Moving supplies became increasingly difficult. Commanders often feared winter almost as much as battle itself. Across medieval Europe, countless armies discovered that nature could defeat even the most ambitious plans. A brilliant strategy meant little if soldiers froze before reaching their destination. A powerful kingdom could still suffer if harvests failed and food became scarce. Winter reminded rulers and peasants alike that human power had limits. Perhaps nowhere was this lesson more visible than in the great forests that covered much of medieval Europe. To modern eyes, forests are often places of recreation. For medieval people, they could inspire both respect and fear. During winter, those forests became even more mysterious. Snow covered animal tracks. Bare branches stretched toward gray skies. Sounds carried differently through the frozen landscape. Travelers moving through woodland paths often found themselves surrounded by silence, a silence so complete that every footstep seemed unusually loud. Wolves occupied a special place in the medieval imagination. Although encounters were not as common as later stories sometimes suggest, wolves remained symbols of the dangers that existed beyond settled communities. On long winter nights, tales of wolves circulated around countless fires. Parents used such stories to teach caution. Storytellers used them to entertain, and children listened closely while shadows flickered across cottage walls. Many of these tales blended reality and folklore together. The medieval world was rich with legends. People spoke of spirits wandering snowy roads, mysterious lights appearing over frozen marshes, creatures hiding deep within ancient forests. Whether believed literally or not, these stories reflected something important. Winter expanded the unknown. Darkness lasted longer. Travel became harder. Information moved more slowly. The boundaries between fact and imagination often felt less certain. For people living centuries ago, the world remained filled with mysteries, and winter seemed to magnify every one of them. As storms swept across the countryside and snow buried familiar landmarks, it became easier to understand why so many legends were born during the coldest months of the year. The landscape itself appeared transformed. The ordinary became unfamiliar. The familiar became strange. And for countless generations, people learned to navigate not only the physical challenges of winter, but also the stories and fears that accompanied it. Not every winter was remembered. Many came and went with little notice beyond the people who endured them, but some winters became legendary. Years later, people still spoke about them. Decades later, chroniclers wrote about them. Generations later, historians continued to study them. These were the winters that pushed entire societies to their limits, the winters that seemed determined to remind humanity how small it truly was. Beginning in the late Middle Ages and continuing into the centuries that followed, Europe experienced a period that modern historians often call the Little Ice Age. Temperatures were not permanently frozen, nor was every year unusually cold, but overall, winters became harsher and more unpredictable. Growing seasons shortened. Harvests sometimes failed. Communities faced repeated challenges as colder conditions spread across large regions. For ordinary people, climate change was not a scientific concept. It was simply life becoming harder. A farmer might notice that crops no longer grew as reliably as they once had. A fisherman might find rivers frozen for longer periods. A family might discover that their food stores needed to last several weeks longer than previous generations had expected. These gradual changes accumulated over time. Each year brought new uncertainty. Some winters arrived early. Others refused to leave. The effects reached every corner of society. When harvests failed repeatedly, food prices rose. Poor families suffered first, but eventually even wealthier households felt the consequences. Entire regions could experience shortages. Markets became unstable. Travel became more dangerous, and rumors spread rapidly from village to village. People searched for explanations. Some blamed unusual weather. Others believed divine forces were involved. Many simply accepted that nature followed patterns beyond human understanding. One particularly severe winter could leave a lasting mark on collective memory. Imagine waking one morning to discover that rivers had frozen solid. Not just small streams. Entire waterways transformed into ice. Places that normally carried boats and commerce suddenly became frozen roads. People walked across surfaces that would usually swallow them in seconds. Markets appeared on ice. Travel routes changed. The landscape itself seemed altered. Historical records describe winters so severe that birds froze in mid-flight. Whether entirely accurate or somewhat exaggerated by storytellers, such accounts reveal how deeply these events affected those who witnessed them. Extreme weather became something people remembered for the rest of their lives. Children who survived particularly harsh winters often told those stories to their grandchildren decades later. Human memory preserves extraordinary experiences, and winter provided many of them. For farmers, prolonged cold could be devastating. Seeds planted too early might fail. Livestock weakened by previous shortages struggled to recover. Communities that barely survived one difficult season could find themselves facing another before they had fully recovered. The cycle became exhausting. Yet despite these challenges, people adapted whenever possible. New agricultural techniques emerged. Communities improved storage methods. Knowledge spread slowly but steadily from one generation to the next. Human beings have always been remarkably inventive when survival is at stake. A harsh winter could destroy plans, but it could also inspire innovation. Necessity encouraged creativity. People learned which foods preserved best, which buildings retained heat most effectively, which preparations offered the greatest protection against future hardships. In this way, winter became an unexpected teacher. Its lessons were rarely gentle, but they were often remembered. And perhaps that is why medieval communities developed such deep respect for the natural world. Not because nature was always kind, but because it was powerful. Powerful enough to shape entire civilizations. Powerful enough to determine whether harvests succeeded or failed. powerful enough to decide whether villages prospered or struggled. Every snowfall, every freeze, every thaw carried consequences, and for people whose lives depended directly upon the land, those consequences could never be ignored. As another cold wind swept across the countryside and another layer of snow settled upon rooftops, medieval families continued doing what countless generations before them had done. They adapted, they endured, and they hoped that spring would arrive before their strength ran out. For all their hardships, medieval people were not merely victims of winter. They found ways to celebrate it as well. This may seem surprising. After all, winter brought hunger, isolation, illness, and uncertainty. Yet throughout Europe, people created traditions that helped transform the darkest months of the year into something more bearable. In many villages, the arrival of winter festivals offered a welcome break from daily worries. The agricultural year had largely come to a pause. Fields rested beneath snow and frost. Major planting and harvesting work was still months away. For a brief period, communities could gather together. Food might still be limited. Life might still be difficult. But people understood the importance of creating moments of joy. The winter solstice held special significance long before the medieval period. For countless generations, people observed the shortest day of the year with fascination. It marked a turning point. The darkness had reached its greatest extent. From that moment onward, daylight would slowly begin to return. The change was almost invisible at first. A few extra moments of sunlight, a slightly longer afternoon. Yet those small differences carried immense symbolic power. The promise that winter would not last forever. The promise that spring would eventually return. In Christian communities, Christmas became one of the most important celebrations of the year. Churches filled with candlelight. Families gathered together. Special meals appeared on tables whenever circumstances allowed. Even households with limited resources often tried to prepare something slightly better than usual. A little extra bread, a small piece of preserved meat, a modest treat saved for the occasion. These moments mattered not because they solved winter's challenges, but because they offered relief from them. Laughter echoed through halls and cottages. Songs filled churches and village gatherings. Stories were shared late into the evening. For a short time, the hardships outside seemed less overwhelming. The human need for celebration proved stronger than the cold. Medieval festivals also served another purpose. They reinforced community bonds. People who spent much of the year focused on survival suddenly found opportunities to gather together. Friendships strengthened, families reconnected, neighbors shared food, stories, and companionship. In a world where survival often depended upon cooperation, these relationships were invaluable. The cold months reminded people how much they needed one another. Winter celebrations acknowledged that truth. Even among the nobility, seasonal festivities played an important role. Castles hosted feasts, musicians performed, guests traveled whenever weather permitted. Great halls glowed with firelight, while snow accumulated outside thick stone walls. Although noble celebrations were often more elaborate than those of ordinary villagers, they reflected a similar desire: to push back against darkness, to create warmth in the midst of cold, to remind people that difficult seasons eventually pass. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval winter life is how closely emotional survival was linked to social connection. Modern people often think of survival in physical terms: food, water, shelter, heat. These things were certainly essential, but medieval communities also understood something equally important. Human beings need hope. A family with enough food might still struggle if despair took hold. A village facing hardship could remain resilient if its people supported one another. Stories, celebrations, traditions, and shared beliefs all helped sustain that resilience. They provided meaning during difficult times. They reminded people that they belonged to something larger than themselves. And perhaps most importantly, They helped make winter feel temporary, because winter often creates an illusion. When snow covers the ground and darkness arrives early each evening, it can feel as though conditions will never change. Yet, they always do. The frozen landscape eventually softens. The ice melts. The birds return. The cycle continues. Medieval people witnessed that transformation countless times throughout their lives. Each winter seemed endless while it lasted, and each spring eventually arrived. That knowledge became a source of quiet strength, not certainty, not comfort, but confidence that hardship, no matter how severe, would not endure forever. As another evening settled over the countryside and candles flickered inside cottages and castles alike, people gathered around familiar faces. Outside, winter remained powerful. Inside, however, warmth took many forms, not only fire, but friendship, family, faith, memory, and hope. Among all the dangers of winter, few inspired more fear than famine. A severe storm could be survived. A freezing night could eventually end, but famine moved slowly, patiently, almost silently, and once it arrived, entire regions could suffer for months or even years. One of the most devastating examples occurred during the early 14th century. Beginning in 1315, Europe experienced a series of harvest failures that would later become known as the Great Famine. Relentless rain ruined crops across vast areas. Fields became waterlogged, seeds rotted in the ground. Grain production collapsed in many regions. What followed was a disaster, unlike anything most people alive had ever witnessed. Food prices rose dramatically. Families that had once managed to survive modestly suddenly found themselves unable to afford basic necessities. Livestock weakened. Communities struggled. Hunger spread from village to village. For ordinary people, the famine transformed daily life into a relentless search for food. Chroniclers of the period described desperate scenes, parents worrying about their children, villagers consuming food that would normally be considered inedible, entire communities growing weaker as shortages continued month after month. Although historians debate some of the more extreme stories recorded at the time, there is little doubt about the scale of suffering. The Great Famine affected millions, and its memory remained alive for generations. Events like these shaped how medieval people viewed winter. A modern person may see a snowy landscape and think of beauty. A medieval farmer might see a reminder of vulnerability. The difference came from experience. Behind every snowfall existed memories of previous hardships, stories of failed harvests, stories of empty storehouses, stories of families who had not survived difficult years. Winter did not create every famine, but it often intensified the suffering that already existed. When food supplies were low, cold weather increased the challenge. Travel became harder. Trade slowed. Livestock required more resources. Every problem seemed to multiply. Yet, even during the harshest years, people searched for solutions. Monasteries often played an important role. Throughout medieval Europe, religious communities maintained food stores, cared for the sick, and provided assistance whenever possible. Not every monastery possessed great wealth. Many faced hardships themselves, but they often served as important centers of stability during uncertain times. Travelers could sometimes find shelter there. The hungry might receive assistance. The sick could seek care. In a world with limited social safety nets, such institutions provided valuable support. Winter also revealed remarkable examples of human ingenuity. People learned to preserve food in numerous ways. Meat could be salted. Fish could be dried. Vegetables could be stored underground where temperatures remained more stable. Grain could be protected in carefully constructed storage areas. These techniques may seem simple today, yet they represented generations of accumulated knowledge. Lessons learned through success and failure. Knowledge passed from parents to children, from neighbors to neighbors, from one century to the next. Without these methods, surviving winter would have been far more difficult. Every preserved meal represented planning. Every stocked cellar represented preparation. Every successful winter reflected countless decisions made months earlier. This connection between seasons shaped medieval life in profound ways. People understood that survival in January often depended upon work completed in August. The future was always being prepared for, even when no one could predict exactly what challenges lay ahead. As snow continued falling across the countryside and icy winds swept through forests and valleys, families relied upon those preparations. Some winters were mild, others were brutal. No one could know which kind of season awaited them. All they could do was prepare as best they could and hope that their efforts would be enough. Sometimes they were, sometimes they were not. And that uncertainty remained one of the defining realities of medieval life, a reality as familiar as the cold itself. Eventually, after months of cold, darkness, and uncertainty, winter began to lose its grip. The change rarely happened all at once. There was no single morning when people stepped outside and declared that winter was over. Instead, the transformation arrived gradually. A patch of earth appeared where snow had melted. A stream began flowing again. The afternoon sun felt slightly warmer against the skin. Birdsong returned to places that had remained silent for months. These small signs carried enormous meaning. For medieval families, they represented more than changing weather. They represented survival. Every person who witnessed the return of spring had endured another difficult season, another test, another winter that could have ended differently. Across Europe, fields slowly emerged from beneath snow and frost. Farmers inspected their land. Animals were brought outdoors more often. Villages became active once again. The long period of waiting was ending. Work would soon begin in earnest. There were seeds to plant, tools to repair, fences to rebuild. Life moved forward. Yet the memory of winter never disappeared completely. People remembered the nights when the wind shook their homes, the days when food seemed dangerously scarce, the weeks when illness spread through families and communities. Those memories remained, shaping decisions for the future. They encouraged preparation, caution, respect for the natural world, because medieval people understood something that remains true, even today. Comfort is temporary. Difficulty is temporary. The seasons always change. Winter eventually gives way to spring. Spring gives way to summer. And summer eventually fades once more. For generations, people lived according to this rhythm. They accepted it, adapted to it, built their lives around it. Perhaps that is one reason their story continues to fascinate us centuries later. Despite possessing none of the conveniences we now consider essential, they endured challenges that seem almost unimaginable. They survived freezing homes, failed harvests, long periods of darkness, isolation, disease, and uncertainty, not because they were extraordinary individuals, but because they were ordinary people doing what human beings have always done: adjusting, learning, helping one another, and continuing forward. Tonight, when you think of winter, it may be easy to picture snow-covered landscapes, warm blankets, and the comfort of modern life. Yet hidden beneath those images is a much older story, a story shared by countless generations who faced winter with far fewer resources and far greater risks. A story of endurance, of patience, and of resilience. As the last traces of snow disappear from the medieval countryside and the first green shoots emerge from the soil, we can leave that world behind and return to our own. The fires burn lower, the villages grow quiet, and the long winter, at last, comes to an end. Thank you for spending this time exploring the frozen world of medieval Europe. Now, as the season fades into memory and spring begins to awaken the land once more, you can simply relax, rest, and drift peacefully into sleep. Yet, even after spring arrived, medieval people never completely forgot the lessons winter had taught them. The memory remained in every repaired roof, every filled grain store, every stack of firewood gathered months before the first snowfall. Preparation was not simply a task, it was a way of life. A family that survived one harsh winter immediately began preparing for the next, because experience had shown them that nature could not be trusted to be gentle. A single season of good weather meant little. Another difficult winter was always waiting somewhere in the future. This constant awareness shaped medieval society in countless ways. Children learned it from their parents. Parents learned it from their grandparents. Wisdom was often passed down not through books, but through stories and experience. How much grain should be stored? When firewood should be gathered? Which foods lasted longest? Which signs in nature suggested an early winter? Knowledge itself became a survival tool. In many ways, medieval life required a closer relationship with the natural world than most people experience today. Modern technology shields us from many seasonal hardships. Heating systems provide warmth, supermarkets provide food, weather forecasts warn us about approaching storms. For medieval people, nature could not be ignored. Every change in temperature mattered. Every shift in the weather carried consequences. The sky was watched carefully. The seasons were observed closely. Life depended upon understanding the world beyond the village walls. And sometimes, despite every preparation, nature still won. A violent storm could destroy months of work. A disease could spread through livestock. A late frost could damage crops. The medieval world offered very few guarantees. Perhaps this uncertainty is one of the reasons faith occupied such an important place in everyday life. Many people found comfort in believing that hardships served a purpose, that suffering could be endured, that difficult seasons would eventually pass. Whether through religion, family, or community, people searched for sources of strength beyond themselves. And often, they found them, because survival was never merely physical, it was emotional as well. The ability to remain hopeful during dark times may have been every bit as important as food and firewood. A person who lost hope could easily lose the motivation to continue. A village that maintained hope often found the strength to endure. That resilience appeared again and again throughout medieval history. Wars came and went. Kings rose and fell. Borders changed. Yet ordinary people continued living their lives, planting crops, raising children, preparing for winter, and waiting for spring. History often focuses on rulers, battles, and great events, but the true story of the Middle Ages was lived by millions of ordinary people whose names have long been forgotten. People who spent cold evenings beside smoky fires. People who worried about their families. People who hoped the harvest would be enough. People who faced winter not with certainty, but with determination. And perhaps that is why their story still resonates today. Because although our world has changed dramatically, many human experiences remain the same. We still face uncertainty. We still endure difficult seasons. We still rely upon one another. And we still find ways to move forward when circumstances seem challenging. The details may be different. The centuries may separate us, but the human spirit remains remarkably familiar. As darkness settles across the medieval countryside one final time, imagine the quiet that follows. The fires glow softly inside distant cottages. A cold breeze moves across sleeping fields. Stars shine above forests that have stood for generations. The people resting beneath those roofs cannot know what the future holds. They cannot know which winters will be remembered by history and which will quietly fade into time. All they know is that tomorrow will bring another day, another opportunity to work, to hope, to endure, and for now, that is enough. The village sleeps, the countryside rests, and somewhere beyond the horizon, another season slowly approaches. If there is one thing winter taught medieval people better than any book ever could, it was patience. Not the patience of waiting a few minutes, not the patience of standing in a line, but the patience required to endure months of uncertainty without knowing how the story would end. Today, information arrives instantly. A weather forecast can predict conditions days in advance. A message can travel across continents in seconds. Food can be delivered to a doorstep with a few taps on a screen. The medieval world moved differently. Slowly, quietly, often without answers. When the first snow began falling, nobody knew whether it would be a mild winter or a devastating one. There were no forecasts, no experts appearing on screens, no reliable way to know what the coming months might bring. People simply watched the sky and hoped for the best. That uncertainty shaped how they viewed time itself. Modern life encourages constant urgency. Everything feels immediate. Everything feels important. Medieval winters encouraged a different perspective. Many problems could not be solved immediately. Some could only be endured. A storm had to pass. A season had to change. The snow had to melt. The land had to recover. Patience was not a virtue people admired from a distance. It was a necessity. Without it, winter would have felt unbearable. Perhaps that is one reason the surviving accounts of medieval life often describe a remarkable sense of acceptance. Not happiness, not resignation, something in between, an understanding that some forces existed beyond human control. The weather, the harvest, the changing seasons. Life became easier once people stopped fighting realities they could not change. Instead, they focused their energy on what they could influence. Repairing a roof, gathering firewood, helping a neighbor, preserving food, preparing for tomorrow. Small actions repeated consistently over time. The same principle remains surprisingly relevant today. Many of the challenges facing medieval families were different from our own, yet the human response often looked remarkably similar. When confronted by uncertainty, people searched for stability. When confronted by fear, they searched for community. When confronted by hardship, they searched for hope. Centuries have passed. Technology has transformed the world, but those instincts remain. As another imaginary winter evening settles over our medieval village, the countryside grows still. The fields sleep beneath a blanket of snow. The roads remain empty. A faint glow shines from cottage windows in the distance. Inside, families rest after another long day. Some are wealthy, most are not. Some have enough food. Others worry about what the coming weeks may bring. Yet all of them share the same night sky, the same winter wind, the same hope that spring will eventually return. And eventually, it always does. The snow melts, the rivers flow once more. The birds return to the trees. The frozen ground softens beneath the warming sun. Another winter becomes a memory. Another chapter closes, and life begins again. For countless generations, this cycle repeated itself. Winter, spring, summer, autumn, again and again. Long before modern nations existed, long before electricity illuminated the night, long before engines, factories, and cities transformed the landscape, the seasons continued their endless journey. And ordinary people adapted to them as best they could. Now, as our own journey through the medieval winter draws to a close, imagine one final scene. A quiet village at dawn, thin wisps of smoke rising into the cold morning air. A rooster calling somewhere in the distance, the first light of day touching the snow-covered fields. The world remains cold, but it is alive. And for the people who call this place home, that simple fact is reason enough for gratitude. The fire still burns. The family still gathers together. The village still stands. And after another long winter, life continues. And so, our journey through the frozen winters of medieval Europe comes gently to an end. The snow-covered fields fade into the distance. The village grows quiet. The last embers of the fire glow softly in the darkness. For a little while, we walked beside farmers, families, travelers, and communities who faced winters far harsher than most of us can imagine. We shared their uncertainty, their struggles, their patience, and their resilience. Yet despite every hardship, they endured, year after year, season after season, just as countless generations have done throughout history. Perhaps that is one of the most remarkable lessons the past can offer us. Even during the longest winters, spring eventually returns. Even during difficult seasons, life continues forward. And even in the darkest nights, people have always found reasons to hope. As you settle more comfortably and allow your thoughts to drift, imagine that distant medieval village one final time. The fields rest beneath the moonlight. The wind moves quietly across the countryside. The fires burn low, and the people of another age sleep peacefully beneath the same stars that shine above us tonight. Thank you for spending this evening exploring the past with the Sleep Archive. There will always be more forgotten stories waiting in the shadows of history, more distant worlds to visit, more quiet journeys through time. But for now, there is nowhere else to go, nothing else to do, only the calm of the night, the comfort of rest, and the gentle knowledge that this story has reached its end. Sleep well, and until our next journey into the past, good night.